I never thought my own family could break me. You grow up believing blood is supposed to protect you, shield you from the world, but in my case, blood sharpened the knife. My name is Elena Vargas, and this is the story of how my mother, my brother, and my sister turned my life into a battlefield. It started with the money, not a few hundred, not a small loan. My life savings, every dollar I had ever scraped together through years of 14-hour shifts, missed birthdays, and constant hustling was gone. And the worst part, they didn't even flinch when I found out, the night I confronted them. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. My mother sat there at the kitchen table, sipping her tea like she hadn't just gutted me financially. My brother leaned back in his chair, smirking. And my sister scrolled through her phone like this was all some boring inconvenience. When I demanded an explanation, my mother didn't even blink. It was for the family, she said, like that made it okay, like I wasn't part of that family. That's when I realized they didn't see me as family, they saw me as a resource. I left that night with nothing but my car, my purse, and a rage that burned hotter than any grief. I sat in the driver's seat, staring at the dark road ahead, and I made myself a promise. I would get it back, all of it, and I'd make sure they'd never forget the cost of betraying me. But revenge isn't a sprint, it's a marathon. I knew if I moved too fast, they'd see me coming, so I did what they would never expect. I went quiet, silent, like I had given up, and that's when the real work began. The first step was finding out exactly what they'd done with my money. It didn't take long. My brother had posted a picture of his new investment on social media. A small bar in the city, decked out in flashy lights and overpriced furniture. My money was in every inch of that place. I went there in disguise, hoodie, baseball cap, and sunglasses. Watching him strut around like he owned the world made my blood boil. But I didn't make a scene, not yet. Every good hunter waits for the perfect shot. My sister's cut of the money went into a business, to an online boutique. Except her boutique didn't actually sell anything, it was just a front. A pretty Instagram page with fake orders and staged photos. She thought she was being clever, and my mother? She'd used her share to pay off debts I didn't even know she had, creditors, gambling markers, and favors she'd owed for years. In a twisted way, I almost pitied her, almost. But pity doesn't pay bills, revenge does. I decided to start with my brother. He was the loudest, the cockiest, and the easiest to bring down. People like him don't know how to hide their mistakes. They broadcast them to anyone willing to listen. He walked through life convinced that the world was his stage, and everyone else was just part of his audience. That kind of arrogance is a weakness, a delicious, exploitable weakness. He thrived on attention, thrived on being seen, heard, and praised. All I had to do was dangle something shiny in front of him, and he'd chase it without asking a single question. I knew I wouldn't have to outthink him, I'd just have to let him outthink himself. I started visiting his bar on the busiest nights. I never approached him directly, just stayed in the shadows, tucked into a booth with a drink I barely touched. The music was loud, the crowd loud enough to drown out most conversations. But my eyes caught every slip: bartenders handing out free drinks to friends, cash missing from the register, and expensive liquor bottles disappearing out the back door. Every single incident went into my notebook. I took photos when I could, videos when I couldn't, and always made note of dates, times, and who was involved. By the end of the month, my little black book of destruction was thick with evidence, and every page was a nail for his coffin. Through an old friend who still worked at the bank, I learned the truth. The bar wasn't the gold mine my brother pretended it was. Behind the flashing lights and curated social media posts, the business was a sinking ship. It wasn't earning it, was bleeding money, and my stolen savings were the only thing keeping it from going under. That revelation didn't make me feel better, it made me hungry. A desperate man is a dangerous man, but he's also reckless, and recklessness leaves a trail. I decided to let him dig himself deeper before I yanked the floor out from under him. That's when I set the bait. I hired an actor, polished suit, designer watch, and a practiced air of casual wealth to pose as a high-rolling investor. He approached my brother one busy Friday night, spinning a story about a can't-miss expansion deal for the bar. The hook was simple: big money, bigger fame. My brother's ego didn't just bite, it swallowed the lure whole. Within weeks, he'd signed a partnership agreement he barely skimmed, convinced he was about to be the next big name in the nightlife scene. I didn't have to pressure him, his own greed pushed him straight into my trap. When my investors suddenly pulled out, my brother's entire house of cards collapsed. The deal included heavy penalties for breach of contract, and suddenly, creditors were banging on his door. The bar couldn't cover the debt, and my brother didn't have the money to keep it afloat. I'd made sure one of those creditors was someone with a reputation for collecting, someone who didn't care about polite phone calls or repayment plans. As I watched the first domino fall, I knew the rest would tumble exactly how I wanted: slow, messy, and impossible for him to stop. With my brother's downfall in motion, I shifted my focus to my sister. Unlike him, she didn't crave the spotlight, she demanded admiration. Her so-called luxury boutique was nothing more than a glorified thrift store, dressed up with gold paint and overpriced tags. Customers thought they were buying imported designer pieces, but I knew better. Half of it came from discount racks and clearance bins. She built her entire image on lies: wealthy clientele, brand partnerships, exclusive imports. But the truth, she was barely scraping by, using fake invoices and shady suppliers to keep up the illusion. I knew exposing her wouldn't just ruin her business, it would destroy her reputation. And that was her real currency. I started small, following her online orders, making note of the suppliers she used. It didn't take long to uncover that her so-called Paris collection had actually been shipped from a warehouse in the suburbs. And the price, dirt cheap. I had receipts, literal and digital. But this wasn't about one big reveal. This was about patience. I let her keep running sales and promoting limited edition stock, while I collected proof of every lie. The more evidence I had, the harder it would be for her to claim ignorance later. I needed someone inside, so I applied for a part-time job at her boutique using a fake name. Of course, a wig, glasses, and a new wardrobe were enough to fool her. She didn't recognize me. She barely looked at her staff unless she needed something. From behind the counter, I watched the scam unfold firsthand. Price tags swapped in the backroom, returns refused despite the policies she bragged about online, and customers sweet-talked into buying exclusive items that were still warm from the delivery truck. Every shift was a gold mine of dirt. When I was sure I had enough, I started leaking little pieces of information online. Anonymous reviews, screenshots of supplier invoices, side-by-side comparisons of designer pieces and their real $12 origins. I didn't drop it all at once, just enough to raise questions. Soon, whispers started. Loyal customers began returning purchases, posting on social media about feeling scammed. Influencers she used to send free clothes to suddenly stop tagging her. Her carefully polished image started cracking, and I could see the panic building in her eyes every time she checked her phone. The final blow came when a local news outlet picked up the story. An exclusive expose aired, complete with hidden camera footage courtesy of yours truly. They showed her selling knockoffs for luxury prices, lying about origins, and violating multiple consumer protection laws. She tried to spin it, claiming a disgruntled employee had sabotaged her, but by then it was too late. Her store's foot traffic dried up overnight, suppliers cut ties, and her name became poison in the fashion scene. One sibling down, two to go. The third one was the trickiest. My youngest brother, my parents' pride and joy, the successful one who could do no wrong. He had a cushy corporate job, a spotless public image, and an Instagram feed that made him look like he'd stepped straight out of a luxury travel magazine. But I knew the truth. He wasn't the hard-working prodigy everyone thought he was. He was a thief, just more careful than the others. He'd been siphoning money from the family business for years, padding his salary with consulting fees and performance bonuses that never existed. My parents didn't see it, or maybe they didn't want to. He was their star, their golden investment. Exposing him wouldn't just destroy his career, it would finally shatter the pedestal they'd put him on. I started by tracing his expenses: private jets, 5-star resorts, custom suits. None of it lined up with his official salary. I dug through public records, found a few shell companies tied to his name, and connected them back to suspicious withdrawals from the family accounts. It was like pulling a loose thread. The more I tugged, the more the whole picture unraveled. Still, I knew a paper trail alone wouldn't be enough. People like him always talk their way out of numbers and paperwork. I needed something personal, something undeniable, something that made even his most loyal supporters turn their backs. Opportunity came when I learned he had a side project, a quiet investment in a startup that was really just a front for laundering money. The founders were flashy, reckless, and already under the radar of a few nosy journalists. I just had to connect my brother to them, and the story would write itself. I arranged a meeting with one of the founders under the guise of business interest and recorded every word. When he bragged about my brother's involvement, I smiled and nodded, all while my phone captured the confession that would ruin him. Once I had the recording, I waited for the perfect moment. It came during a company gala, my brother's night to shine, where he was being honored for outstanding leadership and integrity. I uploaded the recording to a whistleblower site and sent the link to half the guest list before he even took the stage stop. By the time he reached the podium, the whispers had already started. Phones were lighting up, eyes darting toward him, and that confident smile of his faltered just enough for me to know he felt the shift. He could give his speech, but it wouldn't matter. His reputation was already in free fall. The fallout was swift. The board suspended him pending investigation. His startup partners ghosted him, and the press ran the story for days. My parents called it a smear campaign, swearing he was innocent, but even they couldn't ignore the proof plastered all over the internet. I didn't celebrate, not yet. There was still one more target left, the biggest one. The person who'd orchestrated all of this behind closed doors, while pretending to be the family's moral compass: my father. Taking down my father wasn't just about revenge, it was about survival. He'd always been the architect of our family's lies, the one pulling strings from the shadows. Every sibling's bad habit, every shady deal, every betrayal could be traced back to him. He taught us all the rules of the game, then punished anyone who didn't play them to his standards. He was careful, though, too careful, the kind of man who never left a signature unless it benefited him, who made others do the dirty work while he stayed clean. To get him, I'd have to be smarter, slower, patient enough to wait for the one crack in his armor that would bring everything down. I started with the family business, the empire he'd built on honor and integrity. I'd worked there once, long enough to know that integrity was just a word he printed on brochures. The real money came from offshore accounts, fake charities, and under-the-table deals that never made it into the official ledgers. I began tracing donations made in the company's name, looking for patterns. It didn't take long to find the millions funneled through charities that existed only on paper. That money didn't go to helping anyone, it went right back into my father's pockets. To get concrete proof, I needed someone inside, someone close enough to see the unfiltered truth but desperate enough to talk. That's when I found Mark, one of my father's longtime accountants. He'd been loyal for decades, but loyalty doesn't pay medical bills, and his wife's treatment had drained their savings. I offered him an anonymous payout in exchange for information. At first, he refused, claiming he couldn't betray my father, but the more I laid out what my father had done to others, destroyed livelihoods, stolen futures, the more Mark's resistance crumbled. Eventually, he handed me the first stack of damning documents. What Mark gave me was gold, transaction records, offshore wire transfers, and contracts signed by shell companies my father controlled. Every page was a thread in a web of fraud so wide it could strangle the entire business, but I couldn't release it yet. Not without ensuring my father couldn't bury it first. So I planted seeds. Anonymous tips to reporters, quiet leaks to rival companies, enough to make my father paranoid and distracted, pulling his focus in a dozen directions while I built the full case. He didn't even realize the real threat was already inside his walls. Then came the break I needed, one of the fake charities he'd been funneling money through was under investigation for unrelated tax fraud. The authorities were sniffing around, unaware they were inches away from my father's network. All I had to do was connect the dots for them. It was a dangerous move, too much exposure, and he'd know it was me. But the thought of watching him squirm in the spotlight, stripped of his untouchable status, made the risk worth it. For the first time in years, the balance of power was shifting, and this time, it was shifting toward me. The investigation into the fake charity was the perfect pressure point. I crafted an anonymous dossier, transaction logs, wire transfers, and board meeting notes tying my father directly to the scheme. I made sure it looked like the work of a whistleblower inside his company, not a bitter daughter on a vendetta. I sent it to the lead investigator with no return address. Watching from the shadows as the case expanded overnight, suddenly my father's name appeared on their persons of interest list. It wasn't public yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time before the media got wind. My father didn't panic at first. He thrived under pressure. He called emergency board meetings, reshuffled accounts, and leaned on old political favors. But the more he tried to plug the leaks, the more water came rushing in. He couldn't figure out who had turned on him, and that paranoia made him sloppy. For the first time in my life, I saw cracks in his control. Missed calls, short temper, late nights pacing his office instead of sleeping. The man who'd once seemed invincible was finally looking human, and humans can be destroyed. I decided to go for the jugular. My father's biggest fear wasn't prison, it was public humiliation. He thrived on his reputation as a self-made man, a pillar of the community. So I reached out to a journalist I trusted, one who'd been chasing corruption stories for years but never quite had the proof to nail him. I gave her everything: Mark's documents, the charity trail, the offshore accounts. We spent hours cross-checking details, building a story so airtight that even my father's lawyers wouldn't be able to twist their way out of it. The article dropped on a Tuesday morning, and by noon, my father's world was burning. His face was plastered across every news channel, headlines screaming about fraud, embezzlement, and betrayal. Reporters camped outside his office, his house, even the golf club where he used to hold court. He tried to spin it, claiming it was all politically motivated, but no one was buying it. The documents were too detailed, the witnesses too credible. For the first time in decades, my father wasn't the one controlling the narrative. The fallout was instant and brutal. Shareholders pulled their support, clients canceled contracts, and the company's stock tanked. The board voted to suspend him pending investigation, a humiliation he'd never imagined could happen. And yet, watching it all unfold, I felt nothing: no joy, no relief, just the hollow realization that this was only one battle. My father was wounded, but he wasn't finished. If I didn't finish the job, he'd come for me with everything he had left. The first counterstrike came fast. 2 days after the article dropped, I received a summons. My father was suing me for defamation and conspiracy to damage the family business. It was laughable, but it forced me into the open. Now I wasn't just a shadow pulling strings. I was his declared enemy. He must have thought the legal attack would scare me into silence. Instead, it lit a fire in me. If he wanted a war in plain sight, I'd give him one. But I knew this wouldn't just be fought in court, it would be fought in the court of public opinion. He started feeding the media half-truths and outright lies about me, calling me unstable, bitter, even hinting that I'd stolen money from the company when I worked there. Old photographs of me at parties were suddenly evidence of my recklessness. It was a classic smear campaign, and I could almost admire the precision of it, almost. But I had learned long ago how to turn someone's tactics against them, and if he wanted to dig into my past, I'd start digging into his even deeper. Through Mark, I learned that my father had hidden far more than just offshore accounts. He had property in other countries, businesses under fake names, and a trail of money laundering that stretched back decades. If I could connect it to criminal networks, it wouldn't just ruin him, it would destroy him. But getting that kind of proof meant reaching into places where people didn't play by the law. I was stepping into dangerous territory, and the further I went, the more I understood. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. Late one night, a black car started following me on my way home. It never got too close, but I knew enough to recognize a warning. My father had always preferred intimidation over violence, but desperate men make desperate moves. I made sure the journalist who'd exposed him had copies of everything I'd found so far. If anything happened to me, the story wouldn't just continue, it would explode. Then came the subpoena. The investigators on the charity case wanted me to testify. My father's lawyers fought to block it, but the evidence was too strong to ignore. Testifying meant putting everything on record, no going back, no hiding. It also meant facing him in the same room for the first time since the war began. I had to keep my voice steady, my face unreadable, any sign of weakness, and he'd smell blood. When the day came, he walked into the courtroom like he still owned it, expensive suit, smug expression, that same calculating gaze that had always made me feel small as a child. But now, I wasn't a child. I told the truth calmly, clearly. Piece by piece, every lie he'd told, every dollar he'd stolen, every person he'd ruined. And for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before: fear. The testimony made headlines again, fueling the fire. This time, though, the public wasn't divided, they were united in outrage. My father's allies started jumping ship, and even some of my siblings stopped defending him. Still, he didn't break. He doubled down, promising in interviews that he'd clear his name and expose the real criminals. I knew what that meant. He was coming for me harder than ever. That night, my apartment was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but my files were ransacked. Someone had gone through my notes, my computer, my flash drives. I knew it wasn't a random burglary, it was a message. I upgraded my security, moved my most sensitive documents to encrypted storage, and made sure my allies had backups. If he wanted to scare me, he'd have to try harder. I realized I couldn't just defend anymore. I had to strike again, harder. The key was the property he owned overseas. If I could tie it to known criminal organizations, the case would shift from financial crimes to organized crime. Through a contact, I found a former associate of his who'd been cut out of a major deal years ago. Bitterness can be a powerful motivator, and this man had receipts, literal, signed receipts that tied my father to money laundering through those properties. With those documents, the case turned deadly serious. Investigators from multiple countries were now involved, and my father's empire was no longer just crumbling, it was imploding. But I also knew the stakes had never been higher. If I pushed this too far, I might not just ruin him, I might end up in the ground before I got to see it happen. The overseas investigators moved fast. Within weeks, bank accounts were frozen, properties seized, and my father's name appeared on an international watch list. I could feel the walls closing in on him, and part of me thought he might finally surrender, but surrender wasn't in his nature. Instead, he tried to bargain through intermediaries, of course, offers of money, property, even a clean slate if I would just drop everything. The irony of being bribed with my own stolen future almost made me laugh. I refused, and the retaliation came almost immediately. My car was tampered with, brake lines cut. If I hadn't noticed the warning signs that morning, I wouldn't be here telling this story. It was the first time I truly believed he might be willing to kill me. That fear didn't stop me, it sharpened me. I documented everything, called in favors from friends and law enforcement, and made sure anyone involved knew that if I died, my evidence would be in the hands of the most relentless journalist I knew. The trial date was set, and it was bigger than anyone had expected. Multiple charges in multiple jurisdictions. The courtroom was packed. Media, former business partners, even some of my father's ex-allies who now wanted to see him fall. When I walked in, all eyes turned to me. I wasn't the scared daughter anymore. I was the woman who had pulled apart an empire with patience, precision, and just enough ruthlessness to survive. On the stand, my father finally cracked. His mask slipped as prosecutors confronted him with documents, witness statements, and recordings. He snapped at the questions, contradicted himself, and even accused the judge of bias. Watching him unravel in public was surreal. This was the man who had once controlled every move I made, now exposed as nothing more than a desperate, aging fraud. When the verdict came, it was like the air had been sucked out of the room. Guilty on nearly every count. The sentence would be announced later, but I already knew his freedom was gone. His power stripped away. For the first time in my life, I felt the weight lift. The war wasn't over yet, but the battlefield was mine. Sentencing day was a spectacle. Reporters lined the courthouse steps, microphones shoved in my face as if I were the one on trial. I said nothing. The power was in my silence now, and I wanted him to feel it. When the judge handed down 25 years without parole, my father's face went pale, not with fear, but with the realization that no deal, no bribe, no favor could save him. The empire he'd built over decades was now a prison cell. In the weeks after, I received letters from him pleading, bargaining, raging. Some were scrawled in messy handwriting, others carefully typed as if the formality might undo the damage. I didn't reply to a single one. Instead, I kept building my own life, my own name, without him looming over me. Every success, every smile, every breath felt like reclaiming the years he'd stolen. People asked if I felt bad. After all, he was still my father. I told them the truth. The man in that cell had stopped being my father a long time ago. Blood ties don't excuse betrayal, and family isn't just DNA, it's trust, loyalty, love. And when those are broken beyond repair, you don't owe the person who broke them anything but the consequences they earned. 1 year later, I stood outside the old family home. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling. It didn't feel like the place I grew up anymore. It felt like the scene of a crime. I realized I'd been holding onto the idea of home long after it stopped existing. So I walked away. No dramatic goodbyes, no lingering. The past was a story I'd already finished writing. Now, when I tell my story, it's not to glorify revenge, it's to remind people that betrayal doesn't get the final say in who you become. I learned that cutting toxic people out isn't cruelty, it's survival. Forgiveness, when it comes, is not for them, it's for you, so you can walk forward unshackled. If there's one thing I want anyone listening to remember, it's this. You can lose money, you can lose years, you can lose people you thought would stand by you forever. But if you hold onto yourself, your dignity, your truth, you've already won. And that victory is worth more than anything they ever took from you.